Hello, it's Luminous Star. Welcome to another vlog day. Welcome to the channel. Today's video, please like and or share. My current subscribers, thank you guys and gals so much for being my stars, and thank you for your subscription. If this is your first time visiting Luminous Star, welcome, and please don't forget to check that description box below for further details to today's video. Should you become a new star or a subscriber, please go ahead and check the notification bell. That way, every video and every vlog that comes out, you'll be the first to know. And of course, when I go on live, you will be alerted. Topics of discussion: defining intergenerational and transgenerational trauma. The last and final topic will be the tools, references, and resources of which you can find in the description box below. A summary of intergenerational trauma. Please check the description box below for further reading. A summary of transgenerational trauma. A summary of epigenetics and trauma. Terrifying transferences. Hey there, I'm Luminous Star. Welcome to vlog day number 5. I want to share with you all I was reading a book this morning. I want to read just a couple of highlighted areas, actually 3 highlighted areas, in a book that I have been reading for at least the last 3 weeks now. And I've been mentioning this book, Terrifying Transferences, Aftershock of Childhood Trauma, by Lawrence E. Hedges. And this is a great book to read, and I'm going to read for you just a few of these 3 highlighted areas that I really thought was very interesting, because it talks about the trust issue. Even though the trust issue, somebody who's on the outside looking in, they may think that the trust issue should not be there because it's a pretty good relationship. But for those who have a background in childhood trauma, and they have had narcissistic abuse in their lives since their childhood, they have been in relationships with those with a cluster personality or a narcissistic personality, the trust issue can be there for a lot longer. Now, I'm not sharing this to discourage anyone. I'm just pointing a few things out here that I think are very highlightable, to keep in mind, especially if some of my stars who are reading this book with me. This is great because we're going to be talking about this book in further detail. Okay, I'm going to bring this book back up into discussion, probably on a live stream, and I'll probably make the whole live stream about this book. And of course, this will probably be after I finish reading the book. Okay, so here are the highlighted areas here. Here we go. So through simple conditioning, let me make sure you guys can see that. There we go. So through simple conditioning, the trust relationship itself becomes the object of terror in proportion to whatever extent it was originally unsuccessful in quelling the rising tide of overwhelming distress and pain. Later trust relationships or trust situations are then imbued with this conditioned fear and its accompanying clamor. Okay, I want to stop right there for a minute. Conditioned fear, that's very highlightable. Conditioned fear, because in a lot of the videos that I've done, I mentioned how a cluster B personality and a narcissist, one of the things that they do is they like to invoke or influence fear in other people. Okay, so I think these two words right here are very highlightable, or to keep in mind. Conditioned fear. Clamor takes myriad forms, but in therapy, it functions to produce a breach in interpersonal connection or to limit the possibility of sustained connection. Now, another thing that I've been talking about lately is interpersonal skills, which the narcissist and cluster B personality, they lack. They lack interpersonal skills. So a person who's been in a relationship with a narcissist or cluster B personality during their childhood, and maybe even through their adolescence on into their adulthood, so they had first-hand experience about a person or concerning a person who lacks interpersonal skills. Therefore, the interpersonal connection will not be there. You see where I'm going with this? Because a person who's been in a relationship with a narcissist and cluster B personality, they have first-hand experience, extended experience actually, and being in a relationship that's very dysfunctional with a person who lacks interpersonal skills. Therefore, the interpersonal connection is not there. So when they go see a therapist or a counselor, this is the issue that's going to be taking place here. There's always going to be a trust, well, not always, but there's going to be a trust issue that may be a little bit more challenging than someone who hasn't had a relationship with someone who lacks interpersonal skills. Because a therapist, they can get plenty of clients and people who come into their office. They may have trust issues, but they may not necessarily have had relationships in their childhood with somebody who lacks interpersonal skills, like a narcissist or a cluster B personality. Therefore, the interpersonal connection or the problem with interpersonal connection may not be their case due to narcissistic abuse. But someone who has had narcissistic abuse, especially since childhood, this trust issue is going to be a little bit more challenging. Now, this is why I mentioned this in the live stream the other night. I was talking about how the trust issue, actually on the last vlog that I did, vlog number 4, I was talking about how the trust issue is really more challenging for those of us who have a background in dysfunctional families, dysfunctional relationships with cluster B personality and narcissists. Because one of the things that a narcissist does is they like to use fear to, I'll get to that in a minute. I'll just read this last section because it's going to get into the point that I was just about to make. The person is terrified of connections, of relationship, because interconnectedness in the primordial past was known to be hurtful. Okay, so this is also why there's the trust issue. Nobody wants to get hurt again, right? So a lot of the human thing to do is to protect oneself from getting hurt or being in a very dangerous situation. But the thing about being in a relationship during childhood with a narcissist and cluster B personality is that one is groomed to behave a certain way, to even think a certain way. Okay, so I just wanted to point these highlighted areas out because I think this really speaks to the trust issue that a lot of people deal with when they're dealing with the cluster B personality and the narcissist. And then when they branch out to other people and they want to have healthy relationships, the trust issue is still there. Okay, and it's just very challenging to work through, but it's not impossible. But I really wanted to point this out. Again, the book is Terrifying Transferences. Lawrence E. Hedges is the author, but no worries, I'll leave it in the description box below.
First point, grandparents and or parents who have either a cluster B personality type or who are narcissistic often unconsciously choose a particular child within their family to scapegoat, which can open the door for a continuation of transgenerational and intergenerational trauma onto the next generation. The grandparents and or parents who have either a cluster B personality or a narcissistic personality, very often they leave painful issues unresolved. The painful issues can be their childhood trauma, if there was any trauma at all. But when we're talking about a cluster B personality and or narcissist, very often they have a string of bad romances, and they have a lot of toxic and volatile romances. Sometimes grandparents and or parents who are narcissistic, they will unconsciously choose a child to scapegoat within their family. Sometimes it's intentional because they want the narcissistic supply. I mean, either way, they're aiming for the narcissistic supply. The bottom line is when grandparents and or parents who are narcissistic leave unresolved issues, right? They're trying to avoid those issues. Unconsciously, they will choose a particular child to project all that onto. This is where what's known as the identified patient will come in. The child will be scapegoated. Therefore, the child is an IP or the identified patient within the dysfunctional family headed by a narcissist. But since we're talking about the grandparents and the parents who may have a narcissistic personality or a cluster B personality, when there are unresolved issues, sometimes unconsciously they will choose a child to project all of that onto. So this is where the transgenerational and the intergenerational trauma can be passed from grandparents to parents onto their offspring. It would be either the child who is the offspring of the parents or the grandparents, or the grandchild of the grandparents. But anyway, I think you all get the picture. So it starts sometimes from the grandparents, then it moves on to the parents, then to the child. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the trauma. Possible trauma that grandparents who are narcissists and parents who are narcissists have left unresolved. So it gets passed on to the offspring. Then there you have it. It can go on for generations. Next point. There are many narcissistic parents and or grandparents who have unresolved trauma and choose to project that reality onto their children and grandchildren. The poor coping mechanisms of narcissistic parents and grandparents tend to show under the guise of narcissistic abuse of their children, alcoholism, addiction, emotional illness, mental illness, and or dysfunctional behavior patterns. So as I stated in the previous slide, here's trauma that's unresolved and is being passed on from generation to generation. There are unresolved issues, whether it's from childhood trauma or any other painful issue that the narcissistic parents and or grandparents are choosing to deny. They're choosing to turn away from. So they will sometimes unconsciously choose a child within their dysfunctional family to scapegoat. And again, there's your IP and there is the identified patient within the dysfunctional family headed by a narcissist. Sometimes it's overseen by the narcissistic grandparents. Sometimes the narcissistic parents, they pass on the trauma, sometimes unknowingly. I don't think even narcissistic parents and or grandparents really sit around and scheme and plot how they're going to pass on trauma to the next generation. I don't think it's that cut and dry. I think usually because narcissistic parents and or grandparents are usually aiming for the narcissistic supply, they choose a child to project everything they don't like about themselves onto that child. Unresolved pain. And again, it doesn't have to be childhood trauma. It can be anything else in their past that they choose not to resolve. Let's move forward. If epigenetics has occurred within the parents and or grandparents due to behavior associated with trauma, the gene expression of the scapegoated child or children can also be modified as a result. It is possible that some children who are considered as the identified patient or IP have inherited molecular memories of narcissistic grandparents grandparents and or parents, which can be found within the epigenome. Please check out the description box below for further reading on this particular point.
Are to carry the burdens, misfortunes, the ills, the consequences for all wickedness and poor choices of other family members within the dysfunctional families. Now guys, I don't know about you, but I say that is a very tall order, and it is a very wicked and satanic order. That is a horrific thing, to say the least, to put upon any child. However, it is my opinion, folks, that this is one of the main reasons why a certain child is pinpointed to be scapegoated within a dysfunctional family. It is so they can carry all the burdens, everything that is unpleasant within the family. And I don't care if we're going back generations, that one child is to carry it all. Now, I think this is satanic. The purpose of this is to cleanse the group as a whole by sacrificing the scapegoat. This is seen within the dysfunctional family headed by the narcissist as a righteous, guys, pinpoint that word righteous, because I'm going to make a point about that, as a righteous thing to do, while also possibly obtaining a life of narcissistic supply. It is perhaps from the perspective of the dysfunctional family that the scapegoat is not an individual who possesses a heart, a mind, a spirit, a higher consciousness, or even a soul. The scapegoat is devalued within the dysfunctional family. So basically, guys, what we have here is the child who was pinpointed, unfortunately, to be the scapegoat. Not only are they devalued, but within that devaluation, they are demonized by other family members within the dysfunctional family. And this is headed by the narcissistic parent. You haven't seen that movie Carrie? You know, you might want to check it out, because the character Carrie had a mom who was very religious. She was always holding a cross in her hand, always, talking about she was going to pray for her daughter Carrie. Now I want to go back to that point that I made here about the narcissist as the head of the family is seeing this scapegoating thing as a righteous thing to do. This is why I'm bringing up that movie Carrie, because if you guys who have seen that movie Carrie, remember how the mom was always accusing her daughter Carrie of having a demon inside of her, of being possessed by the devil. Carrie was seen as, actually, Carrie was demonized by her mom, which in my opinion, her mom was a narcissist. Now, it's amazing how a lot of narcissists, they are very religious. They go to church faithfully. But this is to get narcissistic supply. This is what some of us have come to know. So I really wanted you guys to pinpoint on that word righteous, because this is how some of the narcissistic parents, they think when they pinpoint and scapegoat a particular child, that child is seen as evil, as bad, as the worst of the worst, not only within the narcissist, but within that dysfunctional family. It is that particular child that the narcissist parent thinks makes the family dysfunctional. This is what makes the family sick. This is what makes the family ill. This is what's wrong with the family. It is the child who was scapegoated. In the mind of the narcissist, in the eyes of the narcissist, they think it is that scapegoated child who is the problem.
Next point. When one factors in the components of epigenetics, transgenerational and intergenerational trauma, it might become more apparent as to why some adult children of narcissistic parents and or grandparents continue to experience emotional, mental, psychological, spiritual, and physical adverse effects of narcissistic abuse, even after the dysfunctional relationship has ended. Okay, so a lot of adult children of narcissistic parents and or grandparents often continue to experience the aftermath of narcissistic abuse, either mentally, psychologically, spiritually, sometimes even physically. This is where the poor health comes in. This is why some of us continue to experience maybe chronic pain in the body, headaches, digestive issues. All of this is part of the adverse effects of narcissistic abuse. So it's not just mental, it's not just spiritual, it's not just emotional. We can even add psychological and physical to the list of the adverse effects of narcissistic abuse. It is no wonder, even after going no contact, sometimes there are still traces of adverse effects of narcissistic abuse. So grandparents and or parents who are narcissistic or have a cluster B personality, sometimes they do unconsciously pass on their traumas to a child. Usually it's more than one child, but we're talking about the identified patient or the scapegoat child here, because they usually tend to pick only one, even though there can be many children, and often there are many children from generation to generation. The narcissistic parents and or grandparents, they can actually end up mistreating all of them, even though, according to my research, sometimes some of those children, they end up being the golden children. But I'm really focused on the scapegoated child today and the IP child, or the child who is considered the identified patient. The identified patient of a dysfunctional family headed by a narcissist, often, very often, their personality structure contradicts or it is in conflict with the narcissistic parents and or grandparents. Sometimes unconsciously, that is why they're selected as scapegoat, because their personality structure seems to be totally opposite of the narcissistic parents and or grandparents. So unconsciously, that sends off alarm bells to the narcissistic parents and or grandparents, meaning they have unresolved issues that they have not dealt with. Those unresolved issues can be anywhere from childhood trauma to alcoholism to addiction to obsessive compulsive disorders, or whatever the narcissistic parents and or grandparents continue to deny that they have issues with. The identified patient, which is the scapegoated child, often alerts unconsciously or subconsciously those narcissistic grandparents and or grandparents that something is not quite right and they need to deal with it. Narcissistic parents and or grandparents, they usually project whatever they don't like about themselves, or again, whatever is unresolved with them, onto a particular child. When a person factors in the components of epigenetics, transgenerational and intergenerational trauma, it's easy to see why some adult children of narcissistic parents and or grandparents continue to experience the aftermath of narcissistic abuse even after going no contact. Trauma has certain effects. There are certain behaviors that are associated with trauma, such as depression, anger issues, health issues, such as the chronic pain that I was mentioning, the headaches. All of these things are associated with trauma. We can even talk about the PTSD symptoms, complex PTSD symptoms. All of these, again, are associated with trauma. So when trauma is being passed from generation to generation, This is one of the reasons why. Because there are unresolved issues that narcissistic parents and or grandparents project onto children, their offspring. But again, I want to really focus on the child who was selected as scapegoat or who is seen as the identified patient within their dysfunctional family headed by narcissists. Let's move on. Tool number 1. Carefully consider whether or not it would be therapeutic for you to begin researching your family history and ancestral lineage. Narcissists are notorious for being deceptive and keeping family secrets. Therefore, if he or she is a parent or grandparent, it is understandable to consider researching your family history. A lot of narcissists, whether they are a parent or not, they are notorious for keeping deep, dark, dirty secrets, especially if it's going to expose them, right? So a lot of narcissists who are parents and or grandparents, they're not going to necessarily share with their children all of the secrets in the family. So they're not going to be very open. A lot of you right now probably can think of the times when you reached out to your parents wanting to know more about your family, but they were tight-lipped. Okay, so narcissists who are parents, they're notorious for this, especially if those deep, dark, dirty secrets will reveal them as not very, positive, right? Because a lot of narcissists and cluster B personalities, they don't like to look unfavorable to anyone. When that mask slips off, it's usually after someone already has figured him or her out, or they confronted the narcissist and or cluster B personality about their shenanigans. Because narcissistic parents, they tend not to share a lot of things about the family. They tend to want to forget. One of the reasons why they want to forget is because they have unresolved childhood trauma that they are denying. If they start talking to you about how they grew up and how they got along or didn't get along with their parents, that's going to bring up some stuff for them. This may bring up some painful memories for them of which they're trying to forget. This is why they tend to choose a child as the IP child or the scapegoat to project all of that onto. Once again, this is where the intergenerational and the transgenerational trauma gets passed on from generation to generation, because you have grandparents and or parents who are narcissists. They do not wish to share how they grew up. They tend to want to forget how they grew up, because for a lot of them, it poses to bring up a lot of pain. Sometimes narcissistic parents and or grandparents, they will intentionally project onto their offspring as to try to bring about trauma and pain. Okay, so again, that part is debatable. Some people, due to their own experiences, they will say that their narcissistic parents or their grandparents did, place them in a very hostile environment on purpose. But again, this varies from individual to individual. So this is something that some of you may want to consider, just to research your own family history and your ancestral lineage, because you may find out some things about your narcissistic parents and or grandparents that you didn't know as a child. Ironically, it probably would have helped you a lot had you known that information. Narcissistic parents and or grandparents, they usually like to keep the deep, dark, dirty secrets because it narcissistically supplies them, and it keeps them loyal to their false self-images. The false self-images can range from being a martyr to a saint to a victim who just cannot catch a break in life. Let's move forward. Next tool. Remember that your life has purpose regardless of experiencing narcissistic abuse. By choosing to write the epilogue to your story, you can begin to possibly change how your life continues to unfold while healing and thriving forward past the aftermath of narcissistic abuse. Celebrate that you chose not to pass on the dysfunctional family legacy. Now that last sentence, I think, is a highlightable sentence, because a lot of adult children of narcissists, they do choose to not pass on the dysfunctional family legacy. And again, I think that's something to celebrate. Okay? One way to write the epilogue to your story is to interrupt the dysfunctional family legacy. That means you're not passing it on. That is one great way to write the epilogue to your story. Instead of telling the story that your narcissistic grandparents and or parents sold to you. Okay, a lot of us buy it. We buy those lies that our narcissistic parents and our grandparents sell us. So one way to leave a legacy behind for future generations is to write the epilogue to your story by simply stating, today your life has purpose and you have chosen not to pass on the dysfunctional family legacy. Let's move on. Continue to build and expand your support base as you grow. By learning effective tools which are necessary to heal and thrive forward past narcissistic abuse can become a powerful way for you to create a legacy and leave it behind for the next generation within your family and or your community. There may be some people, not only in your family, but in your community who know your story because you shared your story. So you never know. They may be inspired by your story. Some of them maybe have been secretly dealing with the aftermath of narcissistic abuse, and you just never knew that. But because you leave a legacy behind, you have broken the dysfunctional family cycle, okay? You interrupted it. This means that you are already leaving a legacy behind. So if no one told you that today or tonight, I'm telling you, you have already begun to leave a wonderful legacy behind simply by interrupting the dysfunctional behavior patterns within your dysfunctional family. Okay, so celebrate that. And as you continue to build and work your support base, you're growing. Therefore, your support base is expanding. When you learn effective tools and you apply it to your life, that's another way to leave your legacy behind because you are demonstrating your growth. You're thriving forward. You're healing past narcissistic abuse. I don't know about you guys and gals, but that's something to celebrate. All right. Here are the references and resources. You can find the references and resources in the description box below. I'm Luminous Star. I want to thank everyone for joining me today or tonight, wherever you are right now. Of course, I wish you the very best. Stay tuned for more vlogs and stay tuned for more videos.